Laura did not expect that evening to matter, and that was why it hurt so much when it did. She came home earlier than usual, the sky still light. Her mind set on surprising her husband Mark with dinner because it had been one of those distant weeks where they barely spoke beyond routine words, and she believed small efforts could still fix small gaps. The house felt wrong the moment she stepped inside. Not messy or loud, just quiet in a way that pressed on her chest, as if the walls themselves were holding a secret. She placed her bag down, called Mark's name, and when no answer came, she walked into the kitchen and saw his phone on the counter, screen lighting up again and again with messages that would not stop. Laura had never been the type to check devices or question loyalty because their marriage was built on years of trust, shared struggles, feeds, and the belief that love meant safety, but something about the repeated buzzing felt urgent, almost like the phone wanted to be noticed. She told herself she would just silence it, nothing more. Yet when she picked it up, the name Emily appeared, followed by a message that was too personal to ignore, too warm to belong to a casual friend, and in that instant her hands began to shake. She did not rush through the messages. She read them slowly, each word landing heavier than the last. Conversations filled with comfort, affection, and plans that quietly pushed her out of the picture. There were no graphic details, no shocking images, just something worse, a clear, emotional bond that had been growing without her knowing. And that realization made her sit down because her legs no longer felt strong enough to hold her. Laura thought about the life she had built with Mark. The years they spent saving for the house, the holidays with family, the nights they stayed awake talking about dreams. And she wondered when exactly she stopped being part of his inner world. When Mark finally came home, he saw her sitting there with his phone in her hand, and the look on his face told her the truth before he said a single word. He did not yell or accuse her of invading his privacy. He simply sighed, like someone who had been carrying a heavy weight and was finally forced to put it down. He admitted there was someone else, not in a dramatic confession, but in a quiet, tired voice, saying it started slowly. That he did not plan for it to happen. That it made him feel understood in ways he did not know how to ask for at home. Laura listened without interrupting, feeling her heart crack in places she did not know existed. Realizing that betrayal did not always arrive loudly, but sometimes slipped in gently, wrapped in everyday excuses. She wanted to scream, to ask why she was not enough, but the shock kept her calm, and the calm scared her more than anger would have. Mark tried to explain, tried to say it did not mean he stopped loving her. But the words sounded empty because love that hides is not love that protects. That night, Mark slept on the couch, and Laura lay awake in their bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the past year. Searching for signs she missed, wondering if she had been too busy, too quiet, or too trusting. She realized, something painful as the hours passed, that the betrayal hurt not just because of Emily, but because she had sensed the distance long before she saw proof, and she chose to ignore it to keep the peace. As morning came, Laura understood that her life had shifted into a before and after. And the woman she was the night before no longer existed. She did not know yet what she would do or how she would respond, but a new feeling had settled inside. Her a mix of heartbreak and awakening, because once trust is broken, silence becomes impossible. And the story of her marriage had reached a turning point she could no longer avoid. Asterisk. The days after the truth came out moved quickly, yet felt heavy. As if time itself was unsure how to behave inside Laura's broken marriage, because nothing looked different on the outside, but everything felt wrong beneath the surface. Mark acted polite, careful with his words, trying too hard to be normal, making coffee in the mornings and asking simple questions about her day. Yet every sentence sounded rehearsed, like he was afraid one wrong word would end everything. Laura responded calmly, not because she was fine, but because her emotions were stuck somewhere deep, refusing to rise, and that scared her more than tears would have. She went to work, smiled at coworkers, finished tasks, and came home each night, to a house filled with distance, realizing how loneliness could exist even when two people shared the same space. Conversations became short and safe, avoiding the truth sitting between them. And Laura started to notice how often she had been the one holding things together before, excusing Mark's silence, explaining away his absence, convincing herself that marriage meant patience even when her heart felt unseen. One afternoon, after a long day where her thoughts refused to stay quiet, Laura stopped by a small bookstore she used to love, hoping familiar shelves might calm her mind, and that was when she saw Daniel. He was standing near the window, flipping through a book, older than she remembered, but still carrying the same calm presence from years ago. And when their eyes met, recognition came instantly, followed by surprised smiles. They had not spoken in years, yet the conversation flowed easily, moving from shared memories of college to life now, jobs, changes, and the quiet ways people drift apart from who they once were. Daniel listened in a way that felt rare, not interrupting, not trying to fix anything, simply paying attention. And Laura felt herself relax without realizing how tense she had been for days. She did not tell him about Mark or the affair, but something in her voice must have revealed the weight she carried. Because Daniel's kindness felt intentional, gentle, and grounding. When they parted, it felt strange how meaningful such a simple meeting could be, and as Laura walked back to her car, she noticed a small warmth inside her chest. Not excitement, but relief. As if she had been reminded that she still existed outside her marriage. That feeling followed her home, and she hated herself slightly for welcoming it, because loyalty still mattered to her even after it had been broken. Over the next few days, Mark tried harder, asking if she wanted to talk, suggesting counseling, promising change. Yet Laura struggled to believe words that came only after damage was done. She realized how tired she was of carrying hope alone, of waiting for effort instead of sharing it. And this awareness made her quiet, distant, and deeply thoughtful. When Daniel sent a short message asking if she wanted to catch up over coffee, Laura stared at her phone longer than she should have, telling herself it was harmless, just two old friends talking, and eventually she agreed, convincing herself she deserved conversation without tension. Their meeting was simple, filled with laughter and honest talk about life's disappointments. And Laura found herself opening up in small pieces. Careful not to cross lines, yet grateful for a space where she did not feel judged or ignored. Daniel never asked about her marriage directly, but his understanding made it easier to breathe. And Laura noticed how different it felt to be heard without having to explain why she felt hurt. Each time she returned home after seeing him, the silence between her and Mark felt louder, sharper, making her question whether the emptiness had existed long before the affair or if it had been created by it. Laura started to understand something painful but true. That Mark's betrayal was not just a sudden mistake, but a result of distance they both avoided addressing. And while that did not excuse his choices, it forced her to face her own unhappiness. She did not plan anything, did not seek revenge or escape. But the comfort she found in conversation began to matter more than she expected, and that realization frightened her. Late one night, lying awake beside a man who felt like a stranger, Laura understood that her marriage was standing on fragile ground. And the real danger was not another person, but the silence that had grown where love once lived. Because once a heart starts searching for warmth elsewhere, it is already admitting something has been lost. Laura did not plan for her life to take another turn, but it did, and it happened quietly, in ways that surprised her more than any confrontation ever could. She kept seeing Daniel, meeting him under the guise of friendship, talking about old times, about dreams that never quite materialized, about disappointments and small victories. And each conversation pulled her closer without her realizing it, because it was easy, natural, and free from judgment. They walked through parks, shared coffees, and sometimes just sat in silence, watching life move around them, and Laura found herself opening up in ways she had long stopped with Mark, revealing fears, frustrations, and desires she had buried. under years of routine and quiet compromise. Daniel never pushed, never suggested crossing lines. But there was a warmth in his eyes and in his tone that made Laura feel alive. Like she had been asleep for months and only now was waking. One evening, after a particularly difficult argument at home where Mark had dismissed her feelings and insisted everything was fine while nothing felt fine to Laura, she found herself driving to meet Daniel, needing someone who would actually hear her. They ended up at a small cafe, the kind that stayed open late and spent hours talking about life, about mistakes, about moments that could have gone differently. As the night wore on and the cafe emptied, neither wanted the evening to end. Okay? And they sat in the dim light, quiet but aware of each other's presence, feeling a connection that was no longer just friendship, but something more subtle, something unspoken yet unmistakable. Laura went home that night feeling a mix of exhilaration and guilt, because she knew that what she felt for Daniel was not something she should act on. Yet she could not deny it, and it scared her more than anger or heartbreak ever had. She did not cross physical boundaries, but her heart had already done so. And the realization hit her hard the next morning, when Mark was asleep on the couch and she sat in the kitchen with a mug of coffee, staring at the empty space between them, knowing that part of her mind and soul had already shifted. Laura told herself it was justified that Mark had betrayed her first and left her vulnerable. But deep down she knew that using another person's kindness and presence to heal wounds that belonged to her marriage was dangerous. Because feelings could not be compartmentalized neatly, and emotions like hers never stayed where they were meant to. She thought about how her own happiness had been sacrificed, how her voice had been small in a house that should have amplified it, and how Daniel, without asking for anything in return, had reminded her that she mattered, that she deserved attention, understanding, and care, and that was enough to make her heart tremble. Days passed, and each time she met Daniel, the connection grew, subtle and soft, yet powerful enough to shake the foundation of her remaining loyalty to Mark. She began to understand that her feelings were not just about Mark's betrayal, but about her own awakening, about realizing she had allowed herself to be invisible for too long. And that awakening was both thrilling and terrifying. Laura spent nights thinking about what she had done with Daniel. Not with shame exactly, but with a heavy awareness that she had let someone into her heart during a time meant for reflection, and that there was no turning back to the way she had been before, because even if she returned to Mark completely, she would never be the same woman who trusted without hesitation. She realized that love was complicated, messy, and not always confined to loyalty or marriage, and that her actions were a mirror of the neglect and loneliness she had felt. But she also understood that revenge was not her goal. It was survival, the act of keeping herself alive emotionally in a life that had grown dull and distant. Laura did not act recklessly. There were no secret trysts or betrayals in the physical sense. But the line she crossed was in allowing her heart to seek what it had long been denied. And she felt the duality of guilt and relief each time she sat with Daniel, feeling seen without needing to explain every scar. By the time she returned home after one long evening, she stared at the ceiling, letting the water run over her in the shower. Thinking about the complicated truth that Mark's actions had broken her trust, Daniel had awakened her heart, and she was somewhere in between pain and possibility, knowing that the path ahead would require choices she had never imagined making. Laura understood that her marriage was no longer the safe space it once was, that silence had betrayed her before anyone else did, and that the emotional line she had crossed with Daniel could not be ignored because it had revealed a part of her that she had been suppressing, a part that demanded to be acknowledged, to be nurtured, to be respected. And that realization was the most frightening and liberating moment of all. She went to bed that night feeling more awake than she had in months, aware that the next steps would define her future, knowing that the heart could be both fragile and bold, and that every choice now carried weight, consequence, and the possibility of a new beginning, even if it meant walking away from what she thought she had loved most. The breaking point came on a quiet Sunday morning when Laura realized that the weight of unspoken truths could no longer be carried in silence. And she understood that avoiding reality had only made the pain sharper. Mark sat across from her. At the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. His face tired but determined, and he finally admitted the full truth of the affair, confessing that it had ended and that he wanted to fix things if she could forgive him. Laura listened carefully, noting the effort in his voice, the honesty that had been missing before, and she felt a mix of emotions, anger, hurt, but also clarity, because she had spent so long carrying the betrayal alone that she now knew what she truly wanted. With steady words, she told him about Daniel, about the emotional connection that had grown, about the comfort and understanding she had found when she felt invisible, not to hurt Mark, but because she refused to pretend her heart had remained untouched while he had broken her trust. Mark absorbed it in silence, and for the first time in months, they shared a moment of complete honesty where neither hid behind excuses. And Laura realized that transparency, however painful, was the only path forward. They spoke for hours about where things had gone wrong, about the distance that had built over years, and how both of them had been guilty of neglect in different ways. Acknowledging that love alone could not sustain a relationship when attention and care were absent, Laura felt a strange relief, as if naming the truth aloud had lifted some invisible burden. And she also understood that forgiveness was not the same as reconciliation, and that she could not ignore her own heart for the sake of repairing something that had fundamentally changed. Mark asked if they could try counseling, if they could rebuild trust slowly, and while she considered it, Laura knew deep down that the bond between them had shifted irrevocably, that the breach of trust in the space she had sought elsewhere had changed her perspective, and that staying together for the sake of familiarity would be a lie she could not live with. After long conversations, they came to a difficult but mutual decision to separate, choosing to part with respect rather than bitterness. Recognizing the years they had shared, but also acknowledging that forcing a marriage that no longer fit would only create more pain. Laura moved through the following days with a sense of quiet determination, arranging her life carefully, reclaiming space that had been emotionally neglected, and reflecting on the lessons she had learned about herself, love, and the importance of listening to her own heart before sacrificing it for someone else. She did not rush into anything with Daniel, because she had discovered that her attraction to him had been a reflection of what she had been missing, not a simple replacement, and she allowed herself time to heal, to understand her desires, and to build clarity before inviting anyone new into her life. Friends and family offered support, noticing a change in her demeanor stronger, more self-aware, more willing to confront her own needs, and Laura embraced it quietly, realizing that independence did not mean loneliness, but a chance to reconnect with her identity outside of her past relationship. Each morning she woke with a renewed sense of control over her life, learning to enjoy small things, walks in the park, quiet cups of coffee, conversations with friends, and moments of solitude that no longer felt empty, but like a space for reflection and growth. She also discovered a surprising gratitude for the heartbreak, understanding that pain had forced honesty and self-examination, revealing strengths she had never acknowledged, and teaching her that boundaries, emotional awareness, and self-respect were essential in any relationship. Over time, Laura embraced the truth that love is not always about staying together, but about nurturing the capacity to recognize what is right for oneself, and that walking away could be an act of courage rather than failure. She looked back at Mark with no malice, appreciating the good years while accepting the mistakes that had made them incompatible, and she felt a freedom in releasing resentment, understanding that peace comes not from revenge or lingering anger, but from clarity and conscious choice. Daniel remained a part of her life as a friend for a while, offering support and understanding, but Laura learned to balance affection with independence. realizing that emotional fulfillment starts within, not from someone else filling gaps left by betrayal. By the time weeks turned into months, Laura had rebuilt her life with intention, creating routines and spaces that reflected her priorities. She approached new relationships with awareness, careful to avoid repeating past mistakes, and prepared to recognize genuine respect, care, and communication when it appeared. The final lesson, quiet but profound, settled in her heart. Love is complicated, life can be painful, and betrayal can shatter illusions. But from honesty, self-respect, and conscious choices, a stronger, wiser, and more fulfilled person emerges. Laura understood that endings are not always tragic. They can be beginnings in disguise. And as she stepped into her new life, free from illusions and empowered by experience, she carried hope, resilience, and a sense of self-worth that no one could take away, knowing that the next chapter of her story would be written on her terms, with eyes wide open and heart ready for what truly mattered.